Good day. First of all, may I take this opportunity to congratulate all my viewers in France on today, which is Bastille Day, the anniversary of the fall of the Bastille in Paris in 1789, which is a national holiday in France and which is in effect France's national day. It's an extraordinary day in European and world history as well as in French history, and you have my very earnest congratulations on this particular day. Well, today we commemorate the fall of the Bastille in the middle of a global crisis. The president of Serbia has actually said that we are in effect in a state of world war. I'm going to come to what he's been saying in a short while. But before I do, I'm going to focus again on the situation in Ukraine, on the battlefields in Ukraine, because there's been a number of very dramatic developments over the last couple of hours. Firstly, it seems that there's been a major collapse of Ukrainian resistance in northern Donetsk region. It seems that Russian and allied troops have now entered the town of Siversk in northern Donetsk region, which is the one of the 3 points in the defense line, Siversk, Solidar, Bakhmut, that lies in the pathway of the final advance of the Russian and allied armies upon the main concentration of Ukrainian troops in Donbass. I should say the main remaining concentration of Ukrainian troops in Donbass, which is the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation. There's also reports that the Russians and their allies have also reached the town of Solidar, and that they have entered that town as well. Now, Siversk specifically is a small place. It's about 11,000 people in population, or was, before the war started. It's not to be compared, in other words, with the big cities, big towns that we've been hearing about, places like Mariupol, with a population before the war of 450,000, and the Severodonetsk, Lysychansk conurbation, which together with its surrounding towns, all of which taken together formed a single population and industrial grouping, had a population of around 350,000. So Siversk is a small place. So if the Russians have entered it, if their troops have actually entered Siversk, it is highly likely that Siversk will fall within, at the most, I would guess, a few days. I say that, as I often say, I'm not a military specialist, but I wouldn't have thought it would be possible for the Ukrainian forces to defend Siversk for very long. And I suspect the same is going to be true of Solidar. Now, elsewhere, it seems that the Russians have captured more settlements ever closer to Bakhmut, that they're in fact in a position very soon to launch an attack on Bakhmut itself. The Russians, by the way, refer to Bakhmut as Artyomevsk, which is apparently its former name when it was part of the Soviet Union. And I suspect if the Russians are able to enter Bakhmut, there will be a more prolonged battle than the one we're going to see in Siversk and probably Solidar, but I doubt that it will last for very long. In which case, the pathway will be open for the final culminating battle, the battle for Slavyansk, and beyond that, for Kramatorsk. Now, Slavyansk and Kramatorsk are actually some distance from each other. They're not adjoining towns in the way that Severodonetsk and Lysychansk were, with the Seversky Donetsk River flowing in between, but with Severodonetsk and Lysychansk essentially part of the same urban landscape. But having said that, Slavyansk and Kramatorsk are fairly connected to each other. The assumption is that Kramatorsk is the more easy to defend, and that's where apparently the overall headquarters of the Ukrainian forces in Donbass is located. So it may take a little longer, possibly, for Kramatorsk to be captured. Most think that Slavyansk would be difficult to defend, and by the way, Bakhmut is also said for topographical reasons to be difficult to defend. So it could be, it is increasingly looking as if the Battle of Donbass is now entering its final weeks. Now, let's come back to what the president of Serbia, Mr. Vučić, has said. Now, on the one hand, as I said, he's spoken somewhat dramatically about this conflict in Ukraine as being a world war. By that he means, and he's made this clear, I'm not, inferring what he said. What he means by that is that the collective West, the United States and its allies, have been essentially fighting Russia through Ukraine, the Ukrainian military being in effect a proxy force for NATO. And it is on that basis that Mr. Vučić says that this is a world war. Well, I think that is perhaps too strong a description of the conflict. So far, the fighting has been contained to Ukraine itself, but it's with a number of Ukrainian strikes on Russian territory. But I think in a broader sense, Vučić is right, because it does look to me, as I've said in so many programs, as if this battle in Ukraine is part of a global crisis. And it's in some ways the further comments that Vučić has made, which perhaps have attracted less attention, which are the more important ones, because he has suggested that after Slavyansk and Kramatorsk are captured by the Russians, and after the remainder of Donetsk region is cleared by the Russians of all Ukrainian forces, Vučić has suggested that President Putin, the Russian president, intends to make some sort of peace offer. We don't know what it's going to be, but Vučić has predicted that it will be on terms which Ukraine and the West are going to reject. And Vučić then goes on to say that once that offer is rejected, all hell will be let loose. Now, I don't know what he means by that, but my best guess is that the Russians will then unleash a further, perhaps much greater offensive across the rest of Ukraine. And it's important to stress, again, that no area of Ukraine, except possibly, just possibly, the Odessa region, is as heavily fortified as Donbass has been, so that it is highly likely that if this offer is rejected, and if the Russians then go on the offensive, that the tempo of that offensive will be much faster than anything we've seen in Donbass, where the Russians have pursued an incremental battle, reducing one fortified settlement after another as they gradually grind the Ukrainian army defending Donbass down. Remember, this was before the war, widely credited with being Ukraine's best army, and that and as the Russians break this network of defenses that the Ukrainians built up in Donbass over the previous 8 years. Again, there's nothing analogous to this incredibly complex and dense defensive line anywhere else in Ukraine, except just possibly in and around Odessa. So going back to an earlier program made by the Military Summary Channel about a week ago, the Military Summary Channel pointed out that if Donbass is cleared of the Ukrainian army, there is no urban center or geographical barrier that would seriously slow the Russians between Donetsk and the Dnieper River. They would be able to advance very rapidly all the way to the Dnieper River. That would bring them into the heart of Ukraine. That would mean that they would be close to important urban centers like Dnipro, the city of Dnipro, which the Russians still refer to as Dnipropetrovsk. Other places like Poltava and Kremenchuk, and of course there's also the very important city of Zaporozhye further south, which, as I understand it, is actually on the east bank of the Dnieper River, and therefore perhaps easier for the Russians to capture. Now, as I said, if the Russians reach the Dnieper right in this area of central Ukraine, they're already, by the way, west of the Dnieper, south in the southern regions, in Kherson region. I'll come to that in a moment. But if they reach it in central Ukraine, then of course Ukraine is in effect cut in two. So that will be a major event in the war, and of course with the best part of Ukraine's army physically destroyed in Donbass, with the city of Kharkiv, Ukraine's second biggest city, under what looks like increasingly tight siege, well, things will start to look, it seems to me, extremely grim for Ukraine. Now, we will see what happens, and I'm going to make a further guess that when Vucic says that all hell will break loose, he doesn't just mean all hell will break loose in Ukraine, because of course, since he's talking about a global war, a world war, presumably we would start to see further steps taken by the Russians to tighten the economic crisis that's now afflicting the West in general, but Europe in particular. Now, I'm not going to try and anticipate or guess what the Russians might do, if they're indeed planning to do anything. But I think, in light of what Vucic has said, if it is indeed the case that President Putin is preparing to make some sort of offer following the clearance of Donbass, then despite Vucic's prediction that the Western powers will reject this offer, I think they ought to instead to think very, very carefully before they do and work out what the consequences of doing so would be. Now, having said that, I still think, I have to say this, I think it's much more likely than not that they will reject this offer. And I'm also going to guess that we're going to be hearing a lot more over the next few weeks about a possible Ukrainian counter-offensive in Kherson region. The Military Summary Channel, I think, did an extremely good explanation of why, realistically, a counteroffensive in Kherson region is the only conceivable option that the Ukrainians have if they really are going to carry out a counteroffensive. However, as I've said, there are lots of problems, and I suspect one of the biggest of these problems is that, as I said, this all depends very heavily on the effectiveness of the HIMARS system, the multiple rocket launch system, and it must be said medium range or tactical range rocket system, missile system that the United States is starting to provide to Ukraine. And by the way, the Ukrainians have now acknowledged that they are trying to persuade the US to provide them with longer range, 300 kilometer range missiles for this system. Supposedly, the United States is still resisting agreeing to this, but as I said, I have seen the pattern of this conflict. First, the United States says it will not provide a particular weapon system, and then of course it does. So we come back to this Ukrainian counteroffensive in Kherson region, and it seems that the Ukrainians do have some kind of plans for this. Now, the military summary channel suggested that this missile, this HIMARS missile strike on what the Ukrainians claimed was an ammunition dump in Kherson region, and what the Russians say was a saltpeter warehouse, a place with chemical products, in other words, a civilian facility, that the military summary channel has suggested that this was really more a test of the Russian anti-missile defenses in this part of Ukraine, and that the real objective that the Ukrainians have is a dam across the Dnieper River, which, if it's destroyed, would flood a large area of territory, and which might, as a consequence, impede the sending by the Russians of reinforcements to Kherson city and to the west of Kherson city, where the big Ukrainian counteroffensive is likely to happen. And the military summary channel says that he has been informed of this by very high-level Russian sources, so this must be taken extremely seriously. But if that is correct, then it seems to me that the Russians are going to start taking precautions, and they're going to be taking steps to protect this dam. And I ought to say that I've been looking into a little of the history of this, and dams, contrary to what many people think, are actually not particularly easy things to destroy. They're more difficult to destroy than bridges. So it would have to be not just one missile, but probably several of them. And it is an interesting fact that the Ukrainians also launched yesterday an attack with several missiles, a simultaneous attack with several HIMARS missiles into northern Lugansk region. Again, it's not clear what the target was. It doesn't seem to be a target that has achieved anything very much that's changing the course of events on the battlefield. But it could be that the Ukrainians are testing their systems in preparation for some sort of attack, an attack on this dam. What I will say is this: the Russians, as I said, are aware of this, and we're now getting ever clearer confirmation that the Russians are able to intercept and destroy, with their air defenses, HIMARS missiles. So I would have thought that if the Russians have figured out what the Ukrainians are going to do, they're going to be taking multiple precautions to make sure that this dam is protected. And I'm going to say something else. I also do wonder whether, if the dam is indeed destroyed and if this area is flooded, whether it will have quite the effect of impeding Russian reinforcements that the Ukrainians believe it will. Anyway, we shall see what happens. But one thing is indisputable, and that is that over the last couple of hours, the Russians have launched a series of relentlessly powerful missile attacks on Ukrainian military formations in the Kherson region. And this has been apparently on a huge scale. And again, one does wonder whether the Russians are, in effect, getting their blow in first, whether they're acting to weaken and degrade these Ukrainian military formations before Ukraine is able to launch this great counteroffensive. I want to repeat again what I think I've said previously. This counteroffensive is Ukraine's last throw. If Ukraine cannot succeed in a counteroffensive in Kherson region, given the direction of events in Donbass, and given that the likelihood that the Russians will then advance all the way to the Dnieper, then it seems to me that fairly soon it will be clear that Ukraine has lost the war. There's been a really rather strange article in the Financial Times which says, can Russia still win in Ukraine? And it comes up with all kinds of reasons why Russia might win and Russia might not win in Ukraine. And a lot of the reasoning about Russia not winning in Ukraine is based on the supposition that the Russians have suffered huge casualties in the war in Ukraine, something like 40,000 men in total. I think, by the way, that is an extremely dangerous assumption. It's based entirely on Ukrainian claims. The BBC, in its latest investigation, was only able to identify 4,000 Russian dead soldiers, nothing like 40,000. And it's difficult to know how the Russians would be able to conceal casualties on that kind of scale. So I think that these assumptions that, that the Russians are, running into huge difficulties in Ukraine based on that assumption of heavy Russian losses is, I think, just to put it mildly, optimistic from the Financial Times and the Ukrainian point of view. I think Russian losses are almost certainly only a small fraction of the numbers that the Financial Times and Western intelligence agencies basing their assessments on Ukrainian and perhaps Polish sources think they are. And I think that is distorting their understanding of the direction of the war. But the most interesting thing about the Financial Times article was that it gave Ukraine only 6 months, or as they said, 6 months to win the war. Didn't quite say what would happen if Ukraine didn't win the war in that time, but it did appear to imply that Ukraine war fatigue in the West would become overpowering, that the West's ability to continue to support Ukraine would start to flag, and that Ukraine's own ability to sustain the war would dwindle after about 6 months. 6 months, of course, brings us to the winter. My own personal view is that Ukraine doesn't have 6 months. As I said, this summer will be the decisive period. Unless Ukraine is able to launch this successful counteroffensive in Kherson region over the next few weeks, then in my opinion, in terms of the war, it is game over. The Russians reach the Dnieper River and are still in control of Kherson region, then I don't really see that Ukraine has any realistic prospects, not so much of winning the war as of surviving it. Anyway, that is my own view. I mean, I obviously, again, to repeat a point that I've made many times, one which, by the way, I notice is now being commented upon with some humour in various places, but which nonetheless remains true. I'm not a military person, and obviously I'm not in possession of all the facts. No one outside perhaps the command staffs in Moscow, conceivably Kiev, and perhaps the Pentagon is in possession of most of the facts, and no one is in possession of all of them. And certainly I am not in possession of a great part of them. I cannot obviously say with any complete certainty what will or won't happen in this war. But my own assessment, based on the situation as I see it now, is that Ukraine actually does not have 6 months to turn things round, perhaps 6 weeks. And that's about all. In 6 weeks' time, I suspect the Russians will have broken all remaining resistance in Donbass, and very likely will be on the Dnieper River in central Ukraine, opposite Dnipro. And as I said, if they're still in Kherson region at that time, then to my mind, the war for Ukraine is irretrievably and conclusively lost. And then it will no longer be a case of Mr. Putin making offers. It will be more a case of Russia either dictating terms to a vanquished Ukraine or perhaps pressing on until it's occupied all of it. That's my own assessment of the situation. It may be right, it may be wrong, you may agree, you may not, but that's how it all looks to me. Anyway, there we are. We will see what happens. I think it is very likely that Bakhmut, at least, will have been captured by the Russians after Siversk and Soledar before the end of July. I think, as I said, over the course of August, it's highly likely that the remaining areas of Donbass will have fallen under Russian control and that Ukraine will have been cleared, Ukrainian troops will have been cleared from that. All that remains is to see what the Ukrainians do in Kherson, and by the way, what the Russians do in Kharkiv. And here, of course, we also see that the Russians are still advancing as well. They're getting ever closer to Kharkiv city. And of course, if Donbass is cleared, there's large Russian forces now located very close to Kharkiv city. And Kharkiv city in the north and Zaporozhye city in the south, to major urban and industrial centres, they would start to look extremely vulnerable if the Donbass were to fall. Anyway, that's where we are. Now, it's not, of course, just a case of the situation, the situation looking extremely grim in Ukraine. We now have a gathering economic crisis in the West. And I'm afraid that it's not just the fact that this economic crisis, which is affecting the West, is now becoming more serious all the time, but we're now having some political decisions made by Western leaders, which to me at least seem, to put it mildly, unwise, and which I think could create an even deeper crisis going forward. Now, let me first begin by correcting something I said yesterday. I said yesterday that it looked as if the Kaliningrad issue had been resolved and that the Lithuanians had been persuaded by the European Union to lift the blockade, the blockade on the land routes to Kaliningrad. I spoke altogether too soon. We now have a European statement which Lithuania has accepted, and it's clear that this is only a partial lifting of the blockade. First of all, whilst rail traffic to Kaliningrad is able to continue, road traffic from Russia to Kaliningrad remains blocked. And as for rail traffic, the European Union is insisting, apparently, that it cannot be increased over and above what was the case before the sanctions, the EU's latest sanctions on Russia were imposed. So the Russians cannot compensate for the cessation of road traffic by increasing railway transit to Kaliningrad. Now, I have to say, I don't think this puts Kaliningrad in any economic or humanitarian or military jeopardy. I mean, the Russians can certainly send more goods to Kaliningrad by sea. And of course, the fact that the rail corridor has been reopened is a partial victory for the Russians. But I'm going to say this, in my opinion, this is the worst decision that the Europeans could possibly have made. And I'll explain why now. Briefly, if they'd stuck to their guns, if they'd said that, Lithuania was entirely in the right, torn up the treaties, the international treaties, well, that would have created a huge crisis around Kaliningrad, but it's unlikely that the Russians would launch an offensive, a military offensive, to reopen the land routes at this time. Their hands are full in Ukraine. It would have been a consistent, logical position. The Russians would have been furious. They'd have been able to keep Kaliningrad supplied by sea, but it would have been an inconvenience for them, and the Europeans would have appeared to stick by their EU member state and NATO ally, Lithuania. That would have been one line to take. Or they could have done something else. They could have said, this is all a terrible mistake. Lithuania went too far. We're going to lift the blockade entirely. We abide by the international treaty. There's no cause for future concern about this because that treaty remains secure. That treaty, Lithuania agreed with Russia back in 1991 when Lithuania became independent of the Soviet Union and guaranteed railway and road traffic to Kaliningrad. What the Europeans have done instead is they've said, well, we are actually breaking the treaty. We're going to allow the treaty to be broken, but we're only going to do it to a certain degree. We're going to interrupt road traffic. We're not going to interrupt rail traffic. Rail traffic, however, is going to be restricted to what it was before February 2022. What that tells the Russians is, yes, the European Union can be pressured to change its position. And what that tells the Lithuanians is that support for Lithuania from the European Union is very far from wholehearted. But it also tells the Russians that the European Union is willing to break the transit treaty, allowing goods to travel by land from Russia to Kaliningrad, and that Kaliningrad's rail and road links, land links to the rest of Russia are therefore in jeopardy. So, in effect, this crisis that I've been talking about, this crisis that has been created around the land route to Kaliningrad, has now been made worse. Because the Russians now know that it's not just Lithuania that's making these steps, it's the European Union as well. It's the European Union is in effect supporting a blockade of Kaliningrad, which violates an international treaty. So all the things that I've said before about this Kaliningrad issue, that it's now become an issue comparable to all those other problems we've had in the past, the Danzig corridor, the Berlin corridor, all of those things. It's now been made unequivocally clear that this problem exists. And I'm sorry to say this, I'm afraid to say this, but sooner or later, it is inevitable that the Russians are going to want to resolve it. And how they resolve it, if one looks at the geography, they can only resolve it, or so it seems to me, through military means. So another spark for military conflict, this time between Russia and a nation, Lithuania, which is a NATO member state, has now been created. I think this is a disastrously bad decision. I'm astonished that the Europeans have made this incredible mistake. Massive damage had already been done through the announcement of the blockade in the first place. That damage has been compounded through this compromise position that the Europeans have come up with. We see here, by the way, again, the nature of the European Union. It's unable to negotiate directly with the Russians on issues like this. It spends all its time negotiating with itself, and what it ends up with is a compromise between the extreme hardliners and those with perhaps more realistic positions or views, which, far from resolving the problem, in the end makes it worse, but does, at least from the perspective of the European bureaucracy, kick the can a little further down the road, which is what the European Union always, it seems to me now, likes to do. Well, there we are. If in 10 years, 5 years' time, we're all here talking about Kaliningrad, you've been warned. It's now, in my opinion, coming. I don't know when, I don't know how, but it's coming inevitably. Perhaps sooner, perhaps later, but we will be there one day. Now, there's another thing that's now coming, and that's even worse, which is that President Biden of the United States is now on a tour of the Middle East. He's going to go to Israel, he's going to go to the Gulf, he's going to meet the Saudis there. It seems unlikely that he's going to be able to persuade the Saudis to increase oil production. The Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi was essentially the most powerful political figure in the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, which is Saudi Arabia's closest ally. He says that UAE oil production is effectively maxed out, and that Saudi oil production almost is, and that the Saudis are not really going to want to increase production, and probably cannot increase oil production to anything like the extent that the United States might want. So President Biden is unlikely to get big increases in oil production from the Saudis, and to be straightforward about it, any increases in oil production by the Saudis would not be enough anyway to make up for the loss of Russian oil. But let's put that aside. What President Biden seems to be trying to do is he's trying to shore up the US position in the Middle East, which has become badly tattered over the last few years, going all the way back, incidentally, to the last years of the Obama administration. And he seems to be trying to do it by rallying conservative Arab and, of course, Israeli opinion against Iran. And he's now gone to Israel, and he's published a joint statement with the Israelis, which says that Israel and the United States together will deny Iran the capability to develop nuclear weapons. Now, how are the United States and Israel going to do that? Let's assume that the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the deal that Iran negotiated with the United States and other world powers in the last years of President Obama's administration, which placed a cap on the extent to which the Iranians were allowed to enrich uranium. Let's assume that that is not revived. All the indications are that the negotiations to revive the JCPOA are gone, that they failed. So let's assume that the Iranians decide that they're going to go on enriching uranium. And let's assume that they enrich uranium to the levels needed to develop a nuclear device. And let's also assume that they start stockpiling uranium, which could be used for that purpose, all of which becomes possible. Prime Minister Bennett of Israel has already spoken about the fact that the best thing to do now that Israel has improved its relations through the Abraham Accords with the Arab Gulf states is to strike at the head of the octopus, as he put it, at Iran itself. In other words, to launch a direct military attack on Iran. It seems to me that this declaration that President Biden has agreed with Prime Minister Bennett paves the way for this. Because if the Iranians do all the things that I've just been saying, if they continue to enrich uranium, because there's no JCPOA to stop them, they continue to enrich uranium, they start stockpiling uranium, then it's highly likely now that Israel will attack Iran. And even if Iran doesn't actually do that, even if it doesn't actually start stockpiling enriched uranium, well, as we've seen so many times in discussions about Iran, Israel has made claims about Iran and its nuclear weapons program, which subsequent events have shown were simply wrong. I can remember decades back when George W. Bush was president. I can remember Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel waving pictures at the UN General Assembly showing a potential Iranian nuclear bomb. It was a cartoon, and talking about Iran being 6 months to a year away from developing such a nuclear bomb. So the Israelis were saying that all those years ago. They've been saying it various times since then. I'm perfectly willing to believe, by the way, that the Israelis themselves, at various times when they've said this, may think it's true. At other times, maybe they've been exaggerating. But let's assume, for example, that the Israelis don't have complete information about the state of the Iranian nuclear enrichment program. Let's assume that the Israelis genuinely believe that Iran is stockpiling enriched uranium, even if in fact it isn't. Well, belief is what drives action. The Israelis believe that Iran is moving into a breakout position where it can stockpile uranium and develop a nuclear device, then it's highly likely, or so it seems to me, that Israel is going to attack Iran. Now, what form would that attack take? Well, surely it would not be a ground invasion, but it would probably be an aircraft and missile strike on Iran. Now, Iran is a significant power. It's shown that it has fairly advanced technologies in some fields. It's shown that its ballistic missile program is now highly developed. It's shown that it has cruise missiles as well. It will probably retaliate in some form against Israel. I'm not going to try and guess how that might happen. But one way or the other, we could see an escalating cycle of war in the Gulf. And it's not impossible, indeed it's highly likely, that Saudi Arabia, which has been trying to improve its relations with Iran, but which still overall considers Iran an enemy, that Saudi Arabia will in some form become involved. And let's assume, which is very likely because Iran is a big country, it's unlikely just to collapse quickly because the Israelis have lobbed some missiles and bombs at it. Let's assume that this war drags on and it expands to include other places. All of this is not possible. Some feel that if there was a war in the Gulf, it's likely. Well, what ship owner in their senses is going to start sending oil tankers into the Gulf in the middle of a shooting war between the Gulf's two most powerful countries, Saudi Arabia and Iran, and between Iran and Israel? It's a time when there are already massive disruptions in the oil market, in the energy market. A war in the Gulf like this would be absolutely catastrophic. I'm not even going to try and put a number on what the price of oil would then become. And yet that is the danger that President Biden, it seems to me, is courting with this extraordinary statement he's just agreed with the Israelis. And again, I ask myself, how is it that this administration, whenever it's given an option of pulling back without any specific particular loss of face, on the contrary, seems to drift into ever more dangerous and confrontational positions, which risk making the position of the United States and of the West even more difficult? They've done this in Ukraine, and we've seen the consequences. They're busy doing it in the Pacific with Taiwan, hinting all the time, taking all kinds of steps that appear to point to a prospective recognition of Taiwanese independence, despite repeated Chinese warnings that this is for China a red line. And in fact, we're now getting more and more information that Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, has apparently directly told Secretary of State Blinken that the United States has now gone to the absolute edge of what the Chinese consider acceptable on the Taiwan issue. Are we going to end up in a situation where we have a war in Ukraine, which Ukraine is losing, the ally of the United States is losing, a war in the Gulf and a war in the Pacific all at the same time? I mean, it hardly seems rational. I mean, I confess, I just don't understand the logic of this at all. I would have thought that given that there's a war going on in Ukraine, the priority at this moment in time for the United States would be to reduce tensions elsewhere, not to increase tensions. And yet, increasing tensions in the Gulf seems to me precisely what this joint statement that President Biden has now made with the Israeli leadership is going to do. And of course, increasing tensions in the Pacific is what this complicated dance around the Taiwan issue that the United States or that the administration is engaging in over the Taiwan issue is doing in the Pacific. So people were talking a few weeks, months ago about a two-front war, conflict with Russia in Ukraine, conflict with China over Taiwan. It's starting to look like a three-conflict war, or at least a potential three-conflict war, with the Gulf drawn in as well. In that event, it seems to me that we would be looking at a crisis that would be a global crisis. And President Vucic's comment that we're in the middle of a world war would start to look frighteningly close to the truth. Well, we're not there yet, and I'm hoping that some moderate voices will prevail, that there'll be some kind of restraining actions taken over the next few weeks. Perhaps somebody will see some logic finally in listening to whatever proposal President Putin does make once Donbass is cleared, which I suspect is probably only a few weeks away now. Perhaps someone will also say in Washington, well, we've issued this statement with the Israelis. Now it becomes even more important to make it very clear to Jerusalem and Riyadh that an attack on Iran is an absolutely no-go place, and that the United States doesn't want to see it happen at this time. Perhaps someone will also say to themselves, the United States is in no position to seek another conflict with another superpower, this time China, in the Pacific over an issue like Taiwan. Well, let's see. All I will say again is this. If we do drift into conflicts in all of these places, and perish the thought, if we do so simultaneously, then the economic consequences for the world, and certainly for the collective West, will be calamitous. I mean, they will be far worse than anything that we have seen up to this point. I mean, I've talked about the problems with the oil supply, but if there's comprehensive sanctions against China because of an armed conflict over Taiwan, then the collapse of supply chains is just going to be horrendous. And by the way, the German economy, which has gambled heavily on exporting machinery and such goods to China, is going to be held under the waterline. So the economic consequences would be simply horrendous. But of course, the geopolitical consequences are incredibly dangerous as well. I mean, we see how the war in Ukraine is step by step being lost. It's highly likely, or so it seems to me, that seems to me the best military advice that I've heard, that a war against China over Taiwan would eventually be lost too. And nobody so far has come up with a scenario, a plausible scenario that I can understand, which would end in a victory over Iran. So if all of these wars are launched simultaneously, the risk is that the United States would become bogged down in one or two places and might end up losing catastrophically in some of them, or perhaps all of them. I cannot see how that helps the position of the United States at all. And of course, the danger always is that if it looks as if that might indeed happen, then out of desperation, the temptation to do something deeply consequential and recklessly dangerous in Washington will grow. On that uncomfortable thought, I'm going to end this program. Thank you for joining me again today. Let me remind you once more that for reasons which I've touched on in previous programs, Alex Christoforou, my colleague, is not for the moment able to appear on YouTube. He will be in a position to do so in roughly a week's time. However, he remains busy and active, working as hard as always, publishing content which you can find on other platforms like Rumble and, above all, Locals, which is at the moment our main alternative platform. If you want to see all of our material, everything that we publish, Locals is the place perhaps first and foremost to go. But we're also publishing all our content on other places, Locals, Rumble, as I said, Super U, ODYSEE, and of course also Telegram. And if you want to support our work, you can do so via Patreon and Subscribestar. You should also consider going to our shop, buying the great things that you will find there. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.